My name is Christopher Wolf. I'm in the Department of Politics here and also president of the American Public Philosophy Institute. And I hope you'll indulge me for a few minutes talking about the APPI and the Scherer lecture before I introduce our speaker tonight. The APPI was established in 1989, bringing together a group, an interdisciplinary group of scholars who were committed in various ways to the Aristotelian Thomistic natural law tradition, with the goal of giving that tradition a more salient voice in current scholarly discussions and national discussions. It sponsors scholarly activities, public lectures, and regional and national student conferences. In recent years, it's focused its activities, especially at the University of Dallas, which is naturally a kind of congenial home for it. Let me try to explain briefly what the APPI is about. Its mission is to, quote, promote a natural law public philosophy rooted in the principles of the American founding, one that pursues freedom and prosperity, grounded on the moral integrity of the culture and of our social and political institutions. So that's kind of our mission statement. Now, needs some explanation. I've been kind of encouraged, you may regret this, but encouraged by some people to actually explain what some of those things mean. And it's in particular natural law and public philosophy. What are these things? Natural law is basically the idea of an objective moral order, at least the basic principles of which are known to all human beings, and from which they derive further principles for guiding their more specific moral choices. It's also a term used for the ethical theory based on that conviction that such an objective moral order exists, that men know its basic principles, and that these principles provide us with some direction in making our decisions in life. So what's a public philosophy? Every nation has to make decisions about how to act as a political community, how to act in foreign affairs, what the responsibilities of governments for social welfare are, the place of the family in society, and how government should relate to it. What is the relationship between our social life and the broadest and most fundamental questions of human life, especially religion? The answers to these questions reflect or embody a certain understanding of human life and of politics, especially an understanding of the nature and ends of the human person. The complex web of assumptions, beliefs, convictions that make up this understanding can be described as a nation's public philosophy. It's a touchstone of legitimacy. It shapes what we think is legitimate for government to do, or what is necessary or appropriate for government to do and not to do. It involves, to some significant extent, a shared way of looking at life, at reality, with a special attention to political and social realities. The principles of a nation's public philosophy are also, at any given time, clear on some things and obscure on others. They're constantly being contested, challenged, reshaped, and public philosophy can evolve both for better and for worse. So the APPI sponsors activities that call for reflection on important political and social issues, perhaps especially issues on which there are deep differences in America today, the resolution of which will shape America's public philosophy into the future. We hope to equip students and other people who attend our events to think about both concrete issues and also about the underlying conceptions of human life, what it means to be a human being, and especially a good human being, that are reflected in our public life and debates. So that's the background, kind of the APPI, the kinds of things we do. Now, what about the Scherer Lecture? This is the 5th annual Scherer Lecture. The Scherer Lecture is named in honor of the late Mary Scherer, daughter of Frank and Jean O'Brien of St. Louis. So a couple of you may know some O'Briens here at UD. Mary received a teaching degree from Franciscan University of Steubenville. She then taught her entire career at St. Ambrose Parish on the Hill, the Italian neighborhood of St. Louis, where she was a teacher much beloved by her students. She died at a young age. Her parents, Frank and Jean, are longtime benefactors to whom I owe a great debt of gratitude. And so I'm very happy by this lecture to honor the memory of their wonderful daughter. We've had a wonderful series of speakers at the Scherer Lecture each year. The first one was Brad Wilcox, University of Virginia, director of the National Marriage Project. The second year was Fred Freddoso of the University of Notre Dame, speaking on Thomistic philosophy. The third one was Father Joseph Katursky, speaking on Catholic social thought, and especially rejecting the idea of having two different silos, one for kind of issues, personal issues, life issues like abortion and so forth, and then another separate issue for social justice issues. He argued for the integration of Catholic social thought. Last year we had Michael Bacalek, who gave a very challenging lecture on the foundations of natural law. He's really one of the brightest natural law thinkers that I know, and gave a very interesting talk. This year's Scherer Lecture, I'm very happy to say, is Helen Alvaré, who's professor of law at Antonin Scalia Law School of George Mason University, where she teaches family law, law and religion, and property law. She also publishes and speaks on matters concerning marriage, parenting, non-marital households, the First Amendment religion clauses, and new reproductive technologies. She is a consultor for the Pontifical Council of the Laity and has assisted the Holy See on matters concerning women, marriage and family, and respect for human life. She cooperates with the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations as a speaker and a delegate to various UN conferences concerning women and the family. Helen is also the founder of a very distinctive and interesting website, womenspeakforthemselves.com, and I urge you to take a look at that sometime. Prior to joining the faculty of Scalia Law School, she taught at Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America. For 3 years, she worked at the Office of General Counsel for the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, where she drafted amicus briefs in leading U.S. Supreme Court cases concerning abortion, euthanasia, and the Establishment Clause. For the next 10 years, she worked with the Secretariat for Pro-Life Activities of the NCCB, lobbying, testifying before federal congressional committees, addressing university audiences, and appearing on hundreds of television and radio programs on behalf of the U.S. Catholic bishops. She also chaired the commission investigating clerical abuse in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. She had previously practiced law as a litigation attorney for a Philadelphia law firm specializing in commercial litigation and free exercise of religion matters. She received her law degree from Cornell University's School of Law and her master's degree in systematic theology from the Catholic University of America. We're very grateful to have her here tonight at UD speaking on The Sexual Revolution is Unsustainable, Marriage, Parenting, and a New Communitarianism.
Thank you. Well, I, for one, was dying to hear about what public philosophy was, so thank you. I had lost track of what that might mean today, so I really was grateful that you went through that. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming out on a weeknight. You know, I've been working in the Catholic world forever, and the fact that I haven't been here is only because I always figured you had everything here. Like, what did you need coming from the outside? You know, you have Catholic everything here. But I am really delighted to be here for the first time, and it's nice to make your acquaintance. What I propose to take up in the next 45 minutes is actually the subject. Even I could write 2 or 3 books about what I'm supposed to say in the next few minutes. But let me tell you what I'd like to accomplish, realistically speaking. I want to think about the hurdles that we face in bringing the sexual marketplace, another way of putting that is people's thinking and behavior about sex, marriage, and parenting, back toward good, while also avoiding the fallacy of the present, which is the idea that, well, things are not really very good right now, and that's really how they're always going to be. Like, it's just too big a thing to confront and move or change. the first thing I'm going to do is then talk about the sexual revolution. I notice you have Alana Newman's movie coming here next week on that. I'm a boring part of that movie. There's a lot more exciting parts to the movie. Alana's really fabulous. So you'll get lots of ideas about what that movie characterizes as the sexual revolution. I'm going to talk about a lot of different ways that you could characterize it, so you can think more broadly about what's really happened. Really in my lifetime, but if you actually talk to scholars, they'll say that the root of the current time is really more like the 1920s. And then if you talk to other scholars, they'll say, like they say about everything, oh, it was the Enlightenment. Okay, but anyway, I'm going to talk about the recent stuff. Then I'm going to point out the problematic consequences of this revolution for children and adults. And then I'm going to talk about why it's not sustainable and what, how we might take this, this thing that's falling apart and unsustainable and just push it a little harder until it at least ameliorates, if not goes away. So let's talk about what the sexual revolution looks like in the first place. I mean, probably what most people think is, well, we have a lot more non-marital sex than we used to have. We have a lot more non-marital births. I mean, in the 1960s, the rate was 5%. Now we've got 40% non-marital births. And among some communities in the United States, as high as 70%. And in the new Hispanic communities in the United States, it's like up to 56%. Okay, so it's getting up there. They think we have lots of sexually transmitted infections. According to the CDC, it's about 1 out of every 4 teenagers. And there's 19 million new ones a year. Later and less marriage, much more cohabitation, a pretty robust divorce rate, still high rates of abortion, even though they've declined from their crazy 1.6 million a year in the 80s, a lot of post-abortion regret. That would actually be just the tip of the iceberg, and it doesn't really get at the thinking or understanding that undergirds what the revolution is and what it did, okay? So here's a bunch of other ways you could frame what the sexual revolution is. The first thing is it disaggregated things that should naturally go together. Sex, marriage, parenting. That's to say, it ignored nature. Or if you're a believer, you can say it ignores what appears to be God's plan. I mean, if you really think about it, God could have brought about new human life any way he wanted, right? Could have come from one sex or the other. Could have grown in a field. He could have handed us each one of them direct from the hand of God. We could have figured out at some point how to manufacture them. But, there's more to be, and all your philosophy professors will tell you this, you understand more by distinction than by description, right? When you describe how new human life comes about, that's intense enough. But then when you think that it came about that way, as distinct from all these other ways, then you realize that it is put at the intersection of the man and the woman, at a time, at an event, that is considered to be an expression of love, right? So it's not just anything. It's associated with something very particular. And then of course, that the child needs extraordinary amounts of care. I hate it when the CDC keeps coming out and putting off adulthood. First it was like, oh, well, it's when you're 17. It's like, no, now your brain's not formed until you're 20. So they keep putting it off and saying the amount of care, especially as very young children, but even as young adults, that people require. All of this goes together because of how new human life comes into being and because of its circumstances when it comes into being, okay? But the sexual revolution disaggregated all of that. So we have sex without children and marriage. We have children without sex or marriage. We have marriage, usually it has sex, but more often now it doesn't have children, okay? So it's disaggregated. Another way we could characterize the sexual revolution is as a decision to ignore the body as having information that is useful for us, okay? Whether because people insist that they are a different sex than their body indicates, or we ignore things like the susceptibility of our bodies to synthetic hormones. It doesn't matter as long as we're separating out sex and children. These synthetic hormones are just the way we have to do it. We ignore the significance of sexually transmitted infections. We ignore the way that sex really at the physical level creates psychological bonds. We ignore, as I've described already, the way that male and female bodies make children, that they create them, that they then have what appears to be, a neurobiologically or evolutionarily disposed desire to take care of those children, right? Et cetera. That we just ignore anything that the body is telling us about sex, marriage, and parenting. You could also describe the sexual revolution, this is quite common, you see, as women now agreeing to perform or suffer without complaint behavior that used to be considered stereotypically bad male behavior. More non-marital sex with less sort of relational understanding of it, more adultery, more porn, and a separating out of sex from children. Even psychologically, not even contemplating that sex has weight in large part because it's associated with children. So often people describe the sexual revolution as women coming to accept these things and coming to live by them, when previously they were considered sort of the behavior of a bad male, okay? Another thing we could say is true of the sexual revolution is that it treats sex as if it had no relation to tomorrow. I mean, you've seen the hookup books. I had to read all 13 of them before I wrote my own book last year, which is the idea that sex may not even get you a text in the morning, let alone get everybody thinking about things like marriage, children, kin, extended family, future together, growing old together, etc. Another way of thinking about the sexual revolution is a revolution that severed sex from the idea of the common good. I mean, I won't go into this because I don't have time for all of it, but we know, and I'll talk a lot about this particular aspect later, that family structure is a huge correlate and cause of people's well-being in their life. And then you have lots of families together that end up making the strength of a community. Okay? So it's no surprise that Oklahoma was one of the first states to embrace all of these different attempts to strengthen marriages, because Oklahoma concluded that the state was suffering at the political, financial, sociological, communal level by its rate of divorce and non-marital parenting, and that the state that makes the cover of the Wall Street Journal for being the strongest, both economically, educationally, robust employment statistics, is Utah, because they have the most stable family structures, and because they end up having a lot of universities that are able to train people for jobs that come to Utah, where a lot of people who are really well disposed to being good workers are able to be trained and then to work. So Utah is actually the biggest economic engine of all the states in the United States now, and it's often traced to their robust family structures, extended families, and the communities that those groups make. Without having time to develop each of these ideas, I do write a lot about these in my book called Putting Children's Interests First in American Family Law. You can also say that the sexual revolution was a time of rampant individualism, the notion that sexual expression, completely indifferent to marriage and recklessly indifferent to children, is the highest constitutional value the United States protects. The only rights that are protected with the language of autonomy, autonomous, a law unto oneself, in U.S. constitutional law are sexual expression rights. They are right to contraception, right to abortion, right to homosexual sodomy, and right to same-sex marriage. Only in those 4 types of cases does the Supreme Court called a right an autonomous a right. Okay, so part of the sexual revolution happened at the judicial level, that the most important right in the whole country is the right of sexual expression. Another interesting aspect of the sexual revolution is the idea that a transgression of sexual norms is itself progress. So, I mean, I like Pope Benedict's view of progress, which is it's learning to love better, out of Spe Salve, his encyclical on hope. But the sexual revolution says that breaking sexual taboos, we start with Romeo and Juliet and we get to, I am not the sex that my body indicates it is. Every kind of thing that was a taboo through the centuries, getting rid of them is progress and freedom. That's a notion, but think about it. All the things we can say were progress, right? Roger Scruton, who you may know, is a very interesting and very funny philosopher who made the comment that the reason we got to the sexual revolution is that after the revolutionaries of the 1960s got through saving everyone else through civil rights and feminism and those types of laws, they're like, well, we ended the Vietnam War, we're kind of through all these battles now. We can have a revolution where all you have to do is have sex in a transgressive way and it's a blow for freedom. Hey, that looks good. And that's Roger Scruton's, on his essay of the sexual revolution. I can strike a blow for freedom just by doing something sexually transgressive. Another aspect of the sexual revolution is the technological imperative. The idea that because technology, assisted reproductive technologies or contraception can, that this must be good and this must be progress. So the separation, again, of children from sex and marriage, or at least children from sex with contraception, is itself progress. It's revolutionary in a forward-moving way. All of these are way more interesting ways of thinking about what we've actually been through in the last couple decades, right, than just the data on these kinds of behaviors, right? So now let me point out briefly, and a lot of this you've heard, a little of it may be a little bit new to you, the problematic consequences for children, but also adults. And let me preview this by saying, you know, in 1968, when the papal encyclical Humanae Vitae came out, the big focus and discussion from that time really until close to the present about Humanae Vitae was that the church was trying to remind people that, that sex had, as I've described before, both unitive and procreative aspects. And the world was really at that time into saying the only way to strike a blow for women and for freedom is to free women in particular from the bondage of their bodies, of getting pregnant, of having children, of staying home and taking care of them. And so the church was poised and always posited as saying, oh, well, remember the procreative aspect of sex. It's not just all about the adults. The irony is that now, fast forward 51 years, and you can see that actually the unitive aspect of sex is actually suffering a tremendous amount as well, which was bound to happen because they're linked, and I'll talk about that. This was maybe best captured, often it's captured well in fiction, if you ever read P.D. James's Children of Men, a dystopian book about people's, when sex is no longer related to tomorrow, and it's just the event of the moment, and there is no possibility for a child who will link the two of you, or for the necessity for the two of you to take care of a child into the future, then the state can't even persuade people to sleep together. It's a very interesting book, but don't even bother with the movie. Can I just say that? The movie turned it into a sort of post-9/11 cry against Homeland Security. I mean, it was almost unrelated to the book. Anyway, so let me talk first about the relationship between family structure hastened by the sexual revolution and sometimes encouraged by it, by its disaggregating of sex, marriage, and parenting. And the relationship between that and first children's well-being and then adults' well-being. Now the literature on this is really vast, and at this point it comes from scholars both on the right and the left. You do not have to be conservative to wonder about the effects of family structure deficits. There is a consensus about divorce, and this started to be gelling in around the 1990s with Judith Wallerstein's book on a 25-year retrospective look at divorce. And there's a lot that's said about that. What I've written about more is non-marital parenting, because the literature on divorce and the public discussion of that is quite mature. With regard to non-marital parenting, because family structure begins at conception, that is, it begins at the sexual choice of the two adults involved, and yet it affects that child for the rest of his or her life, people don't want to talk about it quite as much. And that's why my book was called Putting Children's Interests First in American Family Law. With power comes responsibility. It's all about adults creating children's family structure and the ethical responsibilities that come with that, okay? So today you have a 40% out of wedlock rate, 70% in African American communities, near 56% in Hispanic communities. More and more it has begun during cohabitation, when couples cohabit. Almost half of non-marital births are done in cohabitation. Sadly, that does not mean that those couples move into marriage or stay married. Non-marital birth and cohabitation are both among the top predictors for divorce, with the only exception being that if a couple is engaged at the time they move in together because they've sort of already got that commitment to commitment thing. The other thing about cohabitation today is that it is maybe not quite 50% moves into marriage. That does move into marriage tends to be among people with a little bit more money and education. And now we have, not most, but we're getting close to 50% of Americans will cohabit with more than one person before they marry, or even if they never marry. So we have serial cohabitation. So, and the problem for that is several. One is people are now increasingly less likely to marry even after they have a child during cohabitation. And if they do marry, they are more than 50% likely to divorce. So again, even though some people who have the child non-maritally, the child may end up in a marriage with those parents, more likely than not, those parents will then thereafter divorce, even if they get married after the child is born. How does non-marital birth play a causal role respecting later deficits? You know, most people are inclined to say, gee, there's half the income. And indeed, that does play a role. But to be quite frank, since the government is never going to make up half the income in 40% of American households, that's a real factor that parents still have to take responsibility for when they have a child who is not in a household benefiting from what is now more common, was 2 incomes than 1. Other factors, and Sarah McClanahan, the sociologist at Princeton, who sort of started her big sort of second career in this area by saying, I'm sure that the differences in single and 2-parent households have to do with money, found out that the most she could explain was around 50% of the differential of the child outcomes might be related to income. The other important factors are the things that really are the loss of family and social dynamics that stable parenting provides. 2 parents have more time for supervision. They have more time for guidance. They have more time for interaction. I don't know how many of you who've done any child development stuff have ever seen the famous book by Hart and Risley, where it turns out that actual just volume of words exchanged back and forth between parents and child ends up connecting all those little synapses early, and that in a single parent household, because they have far less of that, the children's brain development is actually appreciably, you can look at it on a screen by age 3, and because early building blocks then set the stage for later, they don't catch up. You'd actually have to hire someone to come in the house and talk to the child 30 hours a week, according to Hart and Risley, in order to make up this deficit. It's not just the amount of words, it's also open-ended conversations, asking questions. Do you like this or do you like this? Why do you like this? What did you think about that? Which simply is just a time deficit that is experienced in single-parent households, okay? And then there's the question of having conversations versus ordering someone to do something, which again, in a household where you have to have one person who's taking care of everything, earning the bacon, frying it in the pan, everything, it's just harder for that person to have the time to do that. So this is part of the reason for the outcomes that we see regarding single-parent households. There's also the father and mother's support for each other. When I'm standing at the top of a tall staircase saying, I'm not sure I can take this baby crying anymore, there's always your husband going, that's okay, honey, hand me the baby, sort of thing. There's that practical relief. There's the greater investment that grandparents and other family members provide. Again, there's something almost evolutionary about this, but grandparents don't invest in cohabiting households as much. And they particularly don't invest on the father's side because they think that the woman will walk with the baby. Right? So you just have a significant, and you can measure it, it's time and money that grandparents invest when the kids are married versus a single parent or cohabiting household. You also have 2 parents' networks of friends, acquaintances, employers, and others, which they enlist on the child's behalf. 2 people saying, here's a summer job, here's a friend of mine you can talk to who's been through the same, here's a woman who's suffered something you've suffered. And then, of course, you have the differing and complementary skill sets that parents of different sexes, on average, bring to the child-rearing enterprise. Okay? It's just different and complementary. That's just how it is in nature. There's also an emerging consensus that maybe the single greatest mediator, other than the lack of time and money and the lack of mutual support, that the single greatest mediator after that, by which non-marital parenting produces these outcomes, is instability. So it turns out if you have a child as a single parent or as a cohabiting parent, you are far more likely as a woman, women form 86% of non-marital households, to repartner. Because you have the child pretty young, the relationships almost always fail, and then you have a new partner in the household. And it is known that the single strongest predictor of violence to a child is having an unrelated male in the household, the mother's new partner. I wrote an article about this, and I got this heartbreaking letter from a grandfather whose grandchildren were killed by his daughter's new cohabiting partner. And they were children from a prior relationship. And he said the cop came in and said, did somebody not tell you not to put an unrelated male in his household? And he said, nobody tells us that. Nobody says cohabiting is dangerous for the children. That's just not how we talk in America, right? Everybody does it. And so it would be considered, harmful to people's dignity if we said, gee, that would be a real risk factor for the children. It's also possible now from that some evidence is emerging from the work of Raj Chetty at Harvard, probably the most prominent economist of economic mobility, right? That boys fare a little worse than their sisters without their father around. So he had this amazing data set, 1 million kids who were brother-sister pairs or single moms. Okay, they had at least one boy and one girl in each family. And what he found is that they were able to measure the mother's prenatal health, the APGAR scores on birth. I mean, it was an amazing data set. The preschool, kindergarten, school. And the boys had fallen behind their sisters by like ages 3 to 4. And by the age 26, their sisters had surged ahead in terms of both education and employment. And some are pointing to this as maybe part of the rationale for why young men are graduating college at now an appreciably lower rate than young women. Researchers, Raj Chetty, David O'Toole, and others are thinking, what is it? Is it that women relate differently to girls than boys? Because women are, as I said, about 86% of single-parent households, and this was just what was studied here. Is it that girls see their mothers doing everything? One of my daughter's best friends is the daughter of a single-parent household. And to say that this girl is accomplished doesn't even begin. To say that her mother was accomplished doesn't even begin. Her mother did everything. The girl does everything. Right? Maybe girls just have a different role model experience when they're being raised by a single mom. And maybe boys are lacking some particular thing that the father brings to the parenting enterprise. We don't have a particular answer to this, but these are some of the theories that are appearing in this economic literature. Family structure is also linked to declining social mobility. You may hear in the US that the gap between the rich and the poor is increasing. Okay? That gap, the single strongest factor producing that gap is not race, which is a lot of people default to and think that it's family structure. Family structure accounts for the single biggest aspect of that gap. And it just turns out that it's that the US government and your state programs, they're pretty good at providing like basic food, clothing, shelter. We really are. I mean, our poverty data, when you actually include everything from food programs to after school programs to temporary assistance to needy families, TAMF, which used to be welfare, to housing vouchers, to that sort of, to public school and everything. Not a ton of people are actually falling below poverty line when you put all of that together. What we're really lousy at, and our programs have not succeeded in at all, is social mobility. And we're now finding that family structure is the single greatest predictor of social mobility. Part of this occurs because of what we're now calling assortative mating. This is all a little law and econ of the family stuff. To put it in a nutshell, men are no longer marrying their secretaries, and poor women live in marriage deserts. What do I mean by this? I mean, before, when women had less education, less experience in employment, you had a lot of men marrying a lot of women who had a lot of assets and gifts to give, but it wasn't going to be that they had a fancy education or a particular job. Now, with women educated at or even surpassing the rates that men are getting higher education, really educated people are marrying one another. And the divorce rates among people who have a college education are really now at like 1950s levels. Okay, divorce is about at a 42% rate, 42 divorces for 100 marriages per year. But remember, some of those are second and third marriages, so it's not a perfect 42%. But people who have gone to college, when you measure them in like the most divorce-prone years, the first 10 years, they're only divorcing at like a 15-16% rate. Where's all that other divorce coming? People who have less economic and academic privilege, okay? So people who are privileged, they're now coming from very stable households. They are marrying other people who have economic and educational privileges like themselves, who are coming from very stable households. They are then helicopter parenting their kids, or you've heard the new phrase is lawnmower parenting. It's just mow down all the obstacles in advance. Don't wait till they encounter them. Just mow it down. Lawnmower parenting, and they are passing on all the advantages of money. They never went through a divorce. They have 2 incomes. They have all these contacts. They have friends. If you ever heard a discussion about summer jobs around my kitchen table, it'd be like, honey, who do you know? Okay, I know this and that. Okay, I'm going to help you do your resume. You take the resume to that one. I'll take the resume to this one. It's who do we know and who can we help? This is helicopter parenting, okay? And then, you have poorer communities. You have people who are starting, non-marital birth rates were 5%, even there in the 1960s. Now they're, in poor communities, they're close to 60%. And it's 40% at national average, but it's close to 60% among the poor. If they didn't go to high school, if they didn't finish high school, you're up to 70%. And you have neighborhoods where there are not a lot of dads around. There's not a lot of modeling for marriage. There is more crime, more drugs, more people incarcerated, and you have a marriage marketplace to the great disadvantage of women, okay? The other thing is you have low opportunity costs of having a baby. Opportunity costs are the trade-off, right? These young women don't actually believe that they have some great job or college education waiting for them, and because human beings are what we are, gifted givers, we're people with a certain amount of gifts, and we're not happy till we give them. And one of the greatest ways of giving a gift is taking care of a child. They have the child in order to be who they are with the opportunities they have in front of them, and without giving away a lot of opportunity that is not realistically in their future. I wrote a huge article about this called Beyond the Sex Ed Wars, but the best book on the subject by Eden and Kafalis is called Promises I Can Keep, Why Poor Women Put Motherhood Before Marriage. So we now have 2 radically different marriage marketplaces for the rich and the poor. And they intergenerationally transmit the advantages and disadvantages of each of these, okay? Now let's talk about some of the effects on the adults of the sexual revolution. As I've mentioned, everybody, the media, churches, everybody is talking, about children and family structure, even though they're not doing a whole lot about it. I'll get to that. But actually, there is very little that they really want to talk about seriously on this, because the answer is, well, it's the consequence of the sexual choices of adults. And we're not gonna wag a finger at them. They're adults. Adults, it's all about consent. There is no good and no bad. As long as you don't rape anybody, as long as it's consensual, that's that. So we can't get too deeply into this question about, creating children's family structures that are problematic, because that would mean telling the adults to make one choice versus another in their sexual lives, and well, that's the holy grail of rights, right, is adults making those choices. However, today, even though we just want to say, oh, we'll take care of children at the back door, we know that children are not being taken care of at the back door. The back door meaning we let adults create them in whatever family structure the adults wish, or if they don't even think about it, it just happens. And then we say, well, the government will have lots of these great programs, and maybe we can replicate what a stable family provides if the government does it. And of course, no study on the right or the left shows that this has or could be done. A couple programs have a couple good results. Nurse-family partnership, moving to opportunity, but most other programs have 0 results. 0. Head Start, billions of dollars a year since the 60s. No results, okay? Couple of small projects have some results in Head Start, but overall as a program, no, okay? So, and this is again, if you look at these programs, they really are geared to try and replicate what a stable family might be able to provide for a child. The government is stepping in and saying, we'll try. The other thing that hasn't worked is contraception, right? We have more abortions. We even have more unintended pregnancies. We have more non-marital pregnancies and more non-marital births than before the feds started to pour a couple $2 billion a year into free contraception. And I don't have time to go through this with you. Michael Pekulik's wife, Catherine, has written some of the definitive pieces on this just this month in Economic Inquiry. Also, Janet Yellen, the former Fed chair, has written definitive pieces about why, with more contraception and abortion in the public realm, you will get more out-of-wedlock pregnancies and births. This is Janet Yellen. This is not a conservative person. But I can tell you that when I go debate this issue at places like Columbia Law School, they always say, well, we're just not doing contraception right. If we put more long-acting contraception in more girls, especially in poor communities earlier, everything will be cool, which is scary if you think about it, right? But that's their answer. So they will not give up on this, that the government, if the government could just spend more, or if we could just get young women to implant like 3 to 10 year contraception during their teen years and keep them sterile through to their 20s, then all of these problems would go away. Okay? So they're really unwilling to talk about assisting the children in any other way, and not at all by advising the parents to be more responsible about the circumstances in which they create children. But it's very interesting that now there's conversation has shifted to the effects of the sexual revolution on adults, okay? It was predicted that sex with children excised, even from the idea of sex. Just not that we're talking about, every time you had a sexual encounter, you would say, oh, I have to be open to a child. Even thinking that the two are related. There's a great article, I want to say it's a Catholic author named Simcha Fisher, who said when she took sex ed in school, what she was told was that unprotected sex makes babies. And she said when she actually got married and realized, oh no, sex makes babies, she goes, oh, that is a very different kind of concept. Think about that. That the thing that a man and a woman do, and it's associated with love, makes babies, as opposed to unprotected sex makes babies. So a failure of technologies results in the disaster we call a child, versus an adult act of love makes the child. When I say we're separating children even from the idea of sex, I'm talking Simcha Fisher kind of thing. The unprotected sex is what makes babies. That we don't even think about it. It's not part of our encounter with the other person. It was predicted that this would be absolutely the pinnacle of happiness for women. You go back and you look at Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood's original writings on this, and I'm quoting, "Sex unlinked with children would make a husband for his wife a veritable god, worthy of her profoundest worship. Through sex, mankind may attain the greatest spiritual illumination which will transform the world and light up the holy path to an earthly paradise." Really, contraception can do all of this. Wow. If you look at the full Betty Friedan and The Feminine Mystique and Simone de Beauvoir and The Second Sex, they predicted that marriage would be insanely happy 24/7 and that women would be insanely free, okay? There were also, of course, predictions that at the very same time that it could bring all of this, that contraception would end unintended pregnancy. It's a little higher than it was in the 70s, just in case you're wondering. And abortion, it went up instead of down. It would end poverty. And make more room for an equal romantic partnership. In fact, in the very first marketing efforts for the pill in the 1960s, its pharmaceutical manufacturer, G.D. Searle, Searle is still around, they've got a ton of money, they delivered to doctors with the first prescriptions a paperweight of a naked, gold, bare-breasted woman, Andromeda. Her head was up and she was breaking chains, and on her back was the word unfettered. Think about it. I mean, we want to laugh at it now, but that was what was promised, okay? But the results have been, not to put too fine a point on it, more mixed, okay? So I think the best writing on this is done by sociologist Anthony Giddens, okay? Not a conservative. Just want to make this point here. In his book, The Transformation of Intimacy, which I highly recommend to anybody in this area, writing in the 1990s, maybe arguably the greatest sociologist of the 20th century. In fact, he, when I saw his name on the back of Mark Regnerus's book, Cheap Sex, that Anthony Giddens had recommended, I mean, I knew Mark was good, but, and I don't know if he's spoken here or not, but Anthony Giddens had endorsed his book as, he said, this is the updated transformation of intimacy. This is the new Bible for this topic. Anyway, Giddens says that when you excise the idea of children from sex, sex is simply just going to be changed. It has to be. He said it's going to narrow the entire focus to the male-female relationship and give rise to what Giddens termed, and he doesn't mean it the way you do, the pure relationship. He didn't mean pure in a virtuous way. He meant all there is the two of them. There's nothing else. There's no other people, there's no tomorrow, there's no society, there's no common good, there's no kin, family, future, anything. He says, continuity of this pure relationship will be determined solely by each person's evaluation of his or her satisfaction for so long as it might last. Philosopher Charles Taylor, author of A Secular Age, and my personal favorite, Sources of the Self, The Making of Modern Identity, sees the unlinking of sex and children as the extension of economic utilitarianism, but now into the sexual arena. When you excise children from sex, and you combine that with the ability of sex to deliver pleasure, sex begins to center upon the usefulness of the body as matter to be used for my purposes. This obviously leads to a great deal of mobility in relationships, which puts at risk everything that depends upon personal relationships. Raising children, those children's well-being, kin, and as we see eventually, and you can measure it economically, eventually, the well-being of the community and the polity, if you do not have these stable structures that can not only take care of one another, form children to be self-sufficient, to be adults who can participate in a pluralistic democracy, who have learned certain skills at the family table, who do not have to be sort of a net cost for the state because they have to make up so much of what they lost, that all of this is at stake in a world of, quote, the pure relationship and a utilitarian sex. Taylor also links this form of utilitarianism and the weak association it encourages to adults surrendering self-governance. And I think Tocqueville had also talked about this too. So long as you've got the family, the state is only going to be able to get so far, because the family will take care of certain basic things and will also keep the state at bay. But if you can't rely upon your family as insurance, and the children can't rely on their parents for insurance, which means always and everywhere, you're going to have a need for a great deal more assistance from the state, and that's simply what we're seeing. Moving beyond the philosophical, several authors have highlighted this sort of the medical or practical relationship between uncommitted sex and future couple stability. Again, seeing how the sexual revolution wasn't just about removing the procreative, but it destabilized the unitive, the good of the couple. If you look at Scott Stanley, who is the sociologist of cohabitation, and Galena Rhodes, with whom he writes a great deal of the time, they have a paper, Before I Do, What Premarital Sexual Experiences Have to Do with Marital Quality Among Young Adults. They chronicle the effects of couples deciding to pursue sex before they have a well-developed knowledge of one another. And they show how their premarital understandings and practices affect their marital stability. Those with more premarital sexual partners, in a pretty dramatic degree, report lower marital stability and quality. Interestingly, even neurologists are in on this question and observe that what you do with your body affects your brain, right? And you're actually shaping your brain, especially as a younger person. Neurologist Norman Doidge, in his book, The Brain That Changes Himself, observed sexual taste is influenced by culture, but often experience, which is then acquired and wired into the brain. Behaviors influence our brain. And these choices, even in the sexual arena, have neurobiological effects upon our brain. Repeatedly, you see adults reporting in these hookup books. There's 13 of them, and there may be more, but I read 13 to write the books. That's my number that I use. There may be more that I didn't find out there. In these hookup genre books, you have all these reports that always begin with, you know what, it's really great, it's really free. You can be yourself, you can do whatever you want, you can experience a new freedom. And then 4 chapters later, what you're hearing is more of the laments, is saying that the early sex that I had prior to really even having a date with this person interfered with my forming a relationship. You have non-relationship sex and pre-dating sex are new words in the sociological literature. I think one of Mark Regnerus' books point out that on average on college campuses, 1 out of every 3 sexual encounters was before a date, was before they had gone anywhere together. It was the day they met. They also say in these books that it's harder to come to know one another through ordinary communications once you've slept together. It's just, talking about opinions, talking casually about anything, it becomes harder to do. And ordinary communications also come to seem more boring. Shedding sex, with even its association with children, also in the words of Zygmunt Bauman. Have any of you read Liquid Modernity or Liquid Love? I know Pope Francis relies on Bauman a great deal.
he really talks about the phenomenon of individualism and a lack of persistent identity and connection in modern society. Amazing guy. He too, like Giddens, writes that if you liberate sex from even its association with children of the future, it, quote, overloads sex with expectations beyond its capacity to deliver. The couple are led away from thoughts of relationship, present or future, and toward preoccupations with the moment, with pleasure or performance. That's it. I think I'm going to have to cut something short here. There's lots of conversation among young couples that the ability of even couples to communicate about what sex means, that if you interview an average couple who's dating, or even cohabiting, they will have very, very different ideas of what the sexual relationship means. One of them will say, I'm testing whether I even like this person a lot. The other one will say, we're going to see if this is kind of dating plus super convenience. Another will say, oh, we're definitely getting ready for marriage. Another will say, it's just so cheap to live together. Another will say, you know, she's really nice to have around, but the sex doesn't really mean anything. And it is very hard to find two people on the exact same page. So it's scrambling even mutual understanding of not only one another, but what it is that you're actually doing, okay? Now, why isn't this sustainable? That should be pretty obvious, but let's go through some list here. If you think about sustainability, and we often think about it in terms of the environment, it really is maintaining a system at its current level and way of operating. It is also avoiding depletion of a natural resource. It's a very interesting way of thinking about it. So we can easily apply this to the question of the possible continuance of the sexual revolution. One simple question, and we don't tend to obsess about this because the US is still at replacement rate, but we're dipping below replacement rate from time to time now, which we weren't. So one of the things is if people no longer associate children with sex, or children just become more of a burden than a benefit, they're more of a cost. You know, we don't have family businesses anymore. Children are consumers, not producers, right? Then it's quite possible that we're actually talking about a shrinking society. So if you look at societies like Japan, who I think they've had 21 or 22 years of they don't allow immigration either. You're not allowed to become a citizen no matter if you live there your whole life if you're not Japanese. So they have had a shrinking society. You have countries like Russia that is like telling people to take Tuesday off and go home and make a baby. And then there's the inimitable Do It for Denmark ad campaign. And the US is not at that level yet, where we're actually telling people, like, please go home and have some babies because we're depleting. But if the sexual revolution really is this all about adults, you know, momentary or even longer term satisfaction with just the adult relationship, then definitely we're going to see what we're beginning to see, which is our birth rate is, I mean, it's obviously not the only factor. All kinds of stuff relating to the economy and other things. But definitely the attractiveness of children and their sort of ordinary relationship to marriage is declining. Also in terms of sustainability, we have the famous study by the economists Stevenson and Wolfers, they were at University of Pennsylvania at the time, of, quote, the paradox of women's declining happiness. That women are the least happy they've ever been measured historically, and for the first time ever, less happy than men. They've usually been more happy. There's a lot of writing about the relationship between the paradox of women's declining happiness and women's position in the sexual revolution. You also just have fewer marriages than we had before. Of adults over 25 who, if the present rates continue, adults over 25 who will never marry from 25 to their death, it was 1 in 10 in 1960 and it's 1 in 5 now. So it's doubled, okay? Why do I say that's not sustainable? Well, people are really not happy with that. You ask most people, they'd like to get married. They would like to have it's not for everybody, it's not everybody's vocation, but it's always been like sort of 90-95% of Americans. And what if it drops to, 80, 70, and so forth? Or, it's 2 in 10. It could go down a far greater amount. There's also the worry regarding how much cultural separation is going to emerge between economic classes and races if the current retreat from family is suffered so disproportionately by poor and minority Americans. And I'll just tell you a little story that relates to this that really brought it home to me. I was doing some charitable work with my parish, and there were a bunch of mothers talking, and it was in DC, and we were both black and white women doing this. And at a certain point, we got talking about this and that about our husbands, and I noticed that this group of 3 black mothers sort of separated themselves off, and one of them said, oh yeah, you know, we were all there because our sons were at this one school, and they said, okay, they're not married, so we have to stop talking about this. We're offending them by talking about our husbands. You know, that's a shame. That's something that we should all have in common. It's a civil right of people, I would think, to be able to be married if they want to be married. And we shouldn't have poverty, social mobility problems, educational deficits that are putting us apart. About a week later, I was at a conference with a bunch of Muslim women from Saudi and Yemen and a couple of other places, and the conversation wasn't going too well. It was a religious freedom conversation, and it was starting, and we were a little stilted. And the phone rings, and one of these women, she picks up her phone, and this was the old days when the phone snapped, you know, it was what do you call them, the flip phone. And she flips her phone, and she bursts out laughing, and she throws it on the table, and she goes, my husband is calling from Saudi Arabia. We were in DC. She goes, he can't find the children's school uniforms. I told him they're where I always leave them. And then he started to yell at me and said, don't say that. Every woman at the table burst out laughing because every one of us has had our husbands unable to find the children's school uniforms. And every one of us has left them in the same place for the last 12 years at the children's school. And then all the women at the table were starting to laugh about their family. Anyway, the conversation just, if we are culturally divided by our family experiences, if we can't talk about father and mother or extended family, or siblings that we know, or if we have very complicated family issues, or very difficult relationships with men in the household who we really don't know that well. I think this is a terrible cultural divide. And we see it on the data, and that week I thought, wow, now I've seen it in action, right? I don't think it is sustainable in the current form of the sexual revolution. Not just because of women's happiness, but also because of men's happiness. And you read a tremendous amount about the epidemic of loneliness in America. And you also read that, of course, men are more likely to medicate it or treat it with suicide. Okay, men are just more likely to do that. And if you actually tease the data about the men who are addicted to opioids, I know it's both sexes, but men are more, or who have significant depression or suicide attempts, you do find a dramatically high amount of family structure deficits, okay? And this is men's suffering of this. What might we propose to assist this unsustainable situation? And here I could go on forever, but I'm only going to go on around 7 or 8 more minutes so we can give you some blissful time to stretch and maybe ask questions. First, I want to note that there's a lot of people that are growing wise to our current situation being problematic. There's a lot of discussion about this. You may note there was a huge survey out that's showing that young people are having sort of less non-relationship sex. Reports issued in 2016 and since indicate that there have been important reductions in non-marital sexual partnering among younger generations and dramatically less sexual experience in high school. When they asked younger Americans about why, they said, well, I have higher priorities, that's one thing. And then they said they also have a distaste for meaningless sex. They said it's not working out for my friends, it's not working out. I don't have these insane expectations for it that people had when it was considered so ultimately taboo. We've almost passed through that fire. Now it's the opposite of taboo, it's common as dirt. And now people are evaluating it for what it actually is, not with a statue of Andromeda breaking her chains and saying that, sex will be the lighting up an earthly path to a heavenly paradise in every case, okay? Another sociologist who writes regularly, in fact, he partners often with Brad Wilcox, they write books together, showed that while only 5% of women in the United States are entering marriage without having had a premarital partner, another 22%, which is now a pretty high figure these days, slept only with the man they ended up marrying. It's pretty interesting. It's 1 in 4 is really been faithful to that same person pretty much their whole life. This doesn't compare with rates 40 years ago, but neither is it nothing. Okay, I think it's probably more than most people thought. And frankly, the number of sexual partners that people have is not as high as you think. When don't even think about the Kinsey report or the Haidt report. They are a joke in psychological and psychiatric circles. They are no longer considered reliable. UChicago put out a study in the mid-90s. The headline of the New York Times about it said, "America's sex lives shockingly normal." And you find that people had women, had fewer partners than men, indeed. But actually, among both sexes, they reported that they felt the most happy, the most secure, the most free, the most fulfilled with their committed, which usually in those cases meant marital partners. Furthermore, I think the hookup books, frankly, are the qualitative description of what the University of Chicago was trying to say, and then is that people really aren't happy with utterly mindless, no tomorrow relationships. And we're seeing a lot more writing about that. Believe me, much more now than when I was your age. People are also talking about the risks of cohabitation and divorce. When you can find Brad Wilcox or Mark Regnerus interviewed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, with their books about the risks of cohabitation or premarital sexual experience to divorce, also talking about the deficit of marriage and its effects among poor and minority Americans, and the huge role this is playing in the gap between the rich and the poor. This is all in the news now. This is pretty stunning. I did not expect to see this kind of conversation. You also have people kind of acknowledging that the government programs aren't really working that well, that we have to try something else. You also have this admissions coming from the right and the left. On the left, Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., scholar Isabel Sawhill says, frankly, for every kid we pull out of trouble with government money, another one falls into the exact same kind of difficulty because of a loss of stable family structure. So our net effect is pretty much zero. David Rybar, another Brookings Institution scholar, said, we really have looked at all the data about all these government programs trying to recreate the web of effects of marriage, and all I can say, he said, is that there's something about marriage and the effects of it that we simply haven't been able to replicate in government programs. Now, with regard to hurdles, we know they exist. People are convinced there's no way to reinvent sex, the sexual revolution. Its patterns have been around pretty much most of your lives. This is not a new thought. Just before sex got reinvented at the dawn of the 20th century, probably a lot of people thought that the mores there were forever and there to stay. We don't want to fall into the fallacy of the present, that everything we're seeing now is permanent and natural. There's a magnificent book by Yuval Harari, the book Sapiens. I'm sure you've seen it. It's one of these sort of mega books talking about the development of the human race and major trends in the development. He writes that, quote, despite millions of years of evolution, which have designed us to live and think as community members, within a mere 2 centuries, we became alienated individuals. Nothing, he says, testifies better to the awesome power of culture. He concludes in his book that sapiens can choose to, quote, transform social structures and the nature of their interpersonal relations and their economic activities and a host of other behaviors within just a decade or two. They've done it before. Isn't that fascinating? We really have gone. We know we need to be communal. It's not just at birth, near death, disability. It's also when you're lonely, unemployed, you're sick, you need a favor, you need someone to teach you something you don't know. We're pretty dependent and interdependent our whole lives. But we're trying to live as if we're not. And Harari is saying that was a very recent development. And there's no reason that with the power of culture, we could not return to understanding ourselves as more communal, with an understanding of our sex, marriage, and parenting as part of that. Okay? Let me just a couple more things. 2 final thoughts on positive strategies, okay? In particular, and here you notice I haven't talked much as Catholics, but let me say 2 things as Catholics. I think the way that we're dealing with these issues, despite the genius of thousands of years of church teaching on this, despite the fact that the Christian difference, the way that we had sexual mores that applied to men equally as they applied to women. The Romans did not, right? Men had one set, women had another. The fact that we have sexual mores that applied to people at the top of the socioeconomic scale and the bottom. The Romans had one scale for slaves, one scale for masters. The fact that we had a unified ethic, the fact that we related it to coming to understand how God loves, right? Permanent, faithful, fruitful. If you've ever read the theology of Vladimir Solovyov, who I know Pope Benedict really likes, on the meaning of love, and he talks about the fact that he's trying to get at sort of what is the symbolism of why did God make sex and love go together? And he says, it's a moment where you come to understand that another person is at the center of the universe with you. Right? You actually come to understand, and I would say my wedding anniversary is tomorrow, and I would have to say that if you took my husband out of the world, the whole world would be off kilter. That his well-being, his happiness, I used to have these dreams. I always said it was when I'd been kind of not very nice to him that day. I had dreams several times throughout what is now a 34-year marriage that I had never married him. And in my dream, I would meet him, and I would say, why are we talking as if I haven't seen you yesterday? And he goes, well, I haven't seen you since college. And I have a freak out in my dream, and my whole life and everything I've ever done seems awful. And just, what was I thinking? Why did I do these other things? Why didn't I secure that? I've had this dream 5 times, which means I've been, I've fallen off the nice wagon 5 times only during that, right? And the idea that you learn to be sacrificial, unifying, creative, permanent, loving, etc., for decade after decade after decade. That there is something about this love that has a particular meaning, okay? This is a Christian value, right? These are, and St. Paul in Ephesians, this is why he compares marriage to the way God loves people. This is why, you all know this, you're here at the University of Dallas, this is why the Old Testament and the New Testament talk about the relationship between God and God's people as a marriage. And they're either faithful, or they're not faithful, etc. And there's something very special about the way we do it as Christians. But my final thought here is that we're not doing it very well right now. I am involved in a lot of the religious freedom cases where a school or a parish or a hospital or a Catholic charity will say, I'm sorry, we can't have a same-sex married employee, or we have a teacher who's a religion teacher, but she had IVF and she was public about it and now the school's in an uproar, or we have a teacher who's cohabiting and she's pregnant. And what I'm finding is the schools are mostly saying to the courts and the opposing lawyers, I can't cooperate in that. It's immoral. And of course the people are hearing, we are judging you as sinners. We are judging you as immoral. You have violated my dignity. Instead, of course, what the institution needs to be doing is 2 things. Number 1, they need to be speaking about what it is that we teach in terms of the modern values that, as Pope Benedict and all the popes really say, you take the truth where you find it. And truth is good, justice is good, equality is good, happiness is good, dignity is good. All these values that you're hearing bandied about, maybe, a pretty thin level, they're good. We have to speak about what we're doing and teaching in this arena in terms of those values. And we have to do it not just because my conscience is involved or I can't have the children exposed to that. Listen to this as a possible example. What if instead of the Little Sisters of the Poor, who I adore and are just in Washington, but what if instead of saying, we don't do contraception at the Little Sisters of the Poor, we can't insure for that, that's against our teachings. What if the Little Sisters of the Poor said instead something like, this is a Catholic community. Part of being a Catholic community is the understanding we have about the value of the women who work here, it was mostly female nurses that was affected to, the value of the men, the value of love, the value of sex, the value of family, the value of parenting. We have a line here that we draw on contraception because it contributes to the community that we are, which is a community that wants to support happiness, freedom, strong families, care for children, capacitating children to be free and be what they, and so forth. We are a community who, not, we don't do that, it's wrong, it's immoral. So the task of translating our teaching to touch modern truths, and in a way that says who our community is and how we are doing what the world wants. We are. We're producing the outcomes that they would dearly love to have, but we're doing it this way, and we're one of a number of plural communities in the United States that are making a contribution to building up the well-being of women, the well-being of men, the stability of children, the stability of marriage, and so forth. That's what I'd like to see. Okay, that's where I think we're falling short. And of course, the final word of advice, which is no surprise, and you could have written it before I got up here, is that we have to be, and I'm stealing here liberally from Luigi Giussani, the founder of Communion and Liberation, we have to be reliable witnesses. Jesus' whole method is to create reliable witnesses who then convince the others, and the others, and the others, and become the presence of God. He's with us, he's here, he's alive, he's resurrected, we have the Eucharist. We are the reliable witnesses to that. We have to live as if, so that anybody looking at us could say, oh yeah, it's possible to live that way. Thank you very much.
We've been asking questions for a while now, and McAfee has the microphone.
Yes, feel free to ask one. So, thank you for your talk. I appreciate your coming here to us at the University of Dallas. One thing I noticed you mentioned was how when the structure of the family as one of the basic fundamental units of society breaks down and isn't there anymore, that opens room for expanding the power of the state. Could you say more about what you meant by that?
Well, there's a couple things on that. I mean, in Catholic social teaching, we're very clear that even though we teach subsidiarity, right, things we are created as rational, creative people with free will, we are meant to use that to solve problems, to take care of one another. And we do say that the state should step in when we fail, and to assist people to be capacitated to what we're supposed to be. But you know, we do hope that people will take seriously their responsibility to do that in the family. That said, the situation we have now, which is 4 out of 10 children, you know, born outside of marriage, and then more than that, living outside of marriage because of divorce, which is about 1 million children a year affected in the U.S. for many decades now. It's inevitable that you're going to have an economic downturn in the households. You're going to need more assistance from the state. You're going to need for things that extended family or family provided insurance for. Everything from retirement savings to help after school, to finding a summer job, to having enough money to buy the basics of food and utilities or pay rent. The family was the insurance system, right? Before Social Security, before health care. I mean, it was Catholic schools, Protestant schools who did school. Before the feds and the states got into the public school business at all, it was all religions and families that did it, right? It was either homeschool or it was religious schools. That's what the start of the U.S. was. It wasn't a public school system until really the 19th century. So it's just inevitable. It cannot be helped that the state will have to step in and be the kinds of insurance and services that a family could otherwise provide. And I mean, Tocqueville said this very early on, and now we're seeing it in a very large fashion. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. And then in the back here.
Yes, you worked for the American bishops. If you could give a speech to the American hierarchy, like the position paper, about what they could instruct their priests to do to bring about the strengthening of the family, because even in the Catholic Church, the divorce rate is going up, the baptismal rate is going down, and so forth. But if you could give a speech that would advise them, what would the points you would make?
You know, I was able to give such a speech to a private executive session of the bishops. Well, what was it, executive? It was just bishops, right? It was nobody allowed in outside. And I have it somewhere. So I was saying this at dinner a little earlier tonight. We have a theology of the body, and it's terrific. But what we don't have is a bridge between that theology of the body and how it forms communities. It's not just about individuals making virtuous decisions and taking care of kids even. It's what does it mean about who we are as parishes, as a Catholic school, etc. They haven't bridged that. The other thing that I would say, and I would give them all of this sort of data, and I'd say, like for instance, I was on the committee that put out the marriage pastoral a couple years ago. I'd like to dissociate myself from that, because what they did is just repeat old theology and social teaching. And I thought they needed to really grapple with dramatic questions that are being posed today. I guess the other thing I would say is a very practical thing, and I don't mean to be too negative on this, but I go to church more than a few times a week, and I don't understand why, with all that the people in those pews are suffering and grappling with, I should hear one more sermon about doing good and avoiding evil, or other kinds of lovely euphemisms that are all true and are not grappling with the angst of 21st century America, whether single or married folks, right? I also would say that the church has not been able to speak in 21st century language about homosexuality. They don't have any words. One of the things that struck me when we did the marriage debate, the marriage came and went. It came and went in just about 10 years, right? And the pro-life movement, we had decades, and we're the best. Nobody can out-talk us on the justice issues on abortion. We're brilliant on them, and we've really thought it 360. On marriage, we never quite got our talking points down. And whether it was on the side of the question of the good of having children know and be known by their parents, and vice versa, or the question of homosexuality and how to address it in connection with 21st century values. We don't have the words. And I would urge them to devote some time to coming up with the words, because I think that's one of the biggest, and I mean, don't even get me started. I mean, on the sex scandal, I mean, it can't be the bishops anymore. It's going to have to be us. Just like Congress, people hate Congress, but they love their local guy or woman. It's going to have to be your local people. It's almost like we have to build up. If you ever read the story of the first couple hundred years of the church and how leaders emerge, that people know, oh yes, we need to talk to you. And then the leaders of all the different Christian communities, oh, we need to get together. Like, that was just part of our DNA as Christians. That's why we call ourselves, one holy Catholic and apostolic. We almost have to rediscover that, because the credibility of the bishops is vaporized on sex now. And I suspect every bishop. I don't think there's any who, maybe one bishop could talk to you in your area, and another bishop could talk to another area and have a really good effect. But as a group, it's no more. And so if you're really wondering why God allowed all this to happen in the economy of salvation, one piece of the answer is that we have to carry this. We don't know why necessarily, but we have to carry this forward right now. I think this gentleman back here.
You kind of answered my question already, but my question is, how can the Catholic Church promote more marriage and teach the openness to life of a married couple? Because I say this because, for example, my family, I am the fourth of 4 children. My family got married when I was 7, my parents. But my mother told me that she always went to a church every Sunday, but she was never taught of this. Like, the priest never preached about this. And it wasn't until she entered the Opus Dei that she knew about this in this community.
Yeah.
But I think there is a lack in the parishes with the priest, because many times the preaching is reduced just to jokes or sentimental
If somebody
stories.
starts telling me about a football game during a homily, I just about lose it. Like, I'm fine with jokes, but like, my goodness, do you realize, the people are coming here in a world of great need? Like, this is like, fine, be pleasant. Do not tell me about a football game. Anyway, so here's one thing, and just I said many things here, but one thing I'll add here is I don't understand, because we have this mass network of Catholic schools, why we're not doing marriage and relationship education from the time children are small. Like, we spend time complaining about the sex ed that often the state is trying to impose. Why haven't we done full out marriage and relationship education from the time people are really small, and helped kids understand, especially because the Catholic Church is highly intelligent. I mean, we invented the university, okay? We're good. We have to be able to figure out a way to explain it at different ages and in terms of the different kinds of values and goals that a child has, and then as they get older, get more mature, about why it is a good thing for, and you know, all this sort of cultural accretion of what marriage is, the ball and chain, the end of your freedom. Now the actual current model of marriage among the well-off is a mutual hedonic exchange. Have you seen this paper? Hedonic means pleasure, right? Stevenson and Wolfers, again, a couple who do the economics of relationships, talk about the fact that among people who are pretty well off, marriage is sort of like, well, I've got my job and my education done, and I think I know where I'm going. You've got your job and education. We're pretty much all packed, and now the two of us are going to come together and enjoy the good things of life better because we'll be in each other's company. And marriage as hedonic exchange. So there's all these sociological models or jokes or cultural accretion of what marriage is, and the fact is, when you actually get in it and you live it, and you understand how profound it is, or how it's also great fun. I mean, I would say my husband is, like, if he wasn't fun, there's no deals off, okay? Like marry a funny guy. It's just very long run useful. It's very, and when you really realize, or then, you know, when you have sickness, or a child is in terrible trouble, or you're furious with your spouse, or some severe financial difficulty, or years of unemployment. I mean, I could go through, you know, and you actually realize what it is. Why can't we transmit that? Of course we can. But we haven't. I'm stunned at the captive audience of the Catholic school population and the lack of marriage and relationship education. To me, that's, in addition to having stuff at parishes, marriage mentors, and, oh, by the way, I should put in a plug here. Do any of you know of Communio? It's a new organization, communio.org. I happen to be on the board now, and it goes into individual parishes, mostly Catholic and Protestant, and it actually shapes a marriage strengthening plan and a dating and everything for your parish. So if the issue in the parish is got a lot of immigrants with families over, you know, half the families overseas, plan for that. If the deal is, you know, everybody who comes into pre-Cana is cohabiting, let's talk about that. If the deal is we seem to have a few too many divorces going on here at this parish, let's talk about that. Anyway, it is a parish-specific marriage action plan that starts at dating. But I want to start way back in younger age. I don't understand. It's so important to people relationships. Just restoring even the affection of women for men and men for women. You know, and that it's a good thing that we are inclined to these relationships, and how entertaining men can be from a woman's perspective, or how whatever else men want to call women. My number one is entertaining. I think he's wonderful in many ways, but the entertainment factor is huge. He's great sense of humor. When they diagnosed with one of our children, who I eventually miscarried, but they diagnosed the child with Down syndrome, and this doctor very gravely says something like, you know, oh, well, this was a Catholic hospital, that I'd want to be thinking about an abortion. And my husband, he burst out laughing. He didn't yell at the guy. He just burst out laughing, and he goes, "Are you freaking kidding me?" He goes, "My wife is already beginning to write in her head the Type A guide to raising a child with Down syndrome." You know, this is what we're doing. He said, "Do not talk to us about abortion. We're going to write a book about it." You know, when I was pregnant when I was much older and miscarried, and you know, my husband was like, he told everybody I'm going to be a grandparent because he was like 49, you know, and he didn't say I'm going to be a parent, you know. Just the charm of the opposite sex should be made more evident to each of us, right? And the goodness of the fact that we're called into relationship for the most part, okay? Any other questions? I thought somebody over here. Yeah, here, and then in the back, yeah.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm wondering if you wouldn't touch upon the annulment discussion now within Catholic society in particular, and whether you think that our discussion of annulment might undermine not sacramental marriages, but natural marriages.
Yeah. So I am not, I mean, I'm generally up to speed, but you'd have, if you had a canon lawyer in here, they'd really be up to speed. So there is a question, the Catholic Church provides annulments based on canon law, and to really simplify it, is that the marriage was never really contracted in the first place. It didn't really exist in the first place. There are a huge number of complaints that it is an abused process. Not only, remember, which one of the Kennedys, did Ted Kennedy get an annulment? I think he did. Anyway, and so did I think one of his kids. And, it was clearly, no, that was probably a sacramental marriage. That was probably in good shape. And so there's a question of abuse. There's a question of their being found too easily. There are certain places in the United States that account, like the U.S. accounts for this outrageous percentage, I think, of international annulment totals. In the discussion around Amoris Laetitia, the Holy See, one of the things that was done, and Pope Francis very much wanted to do, was to make annulments a little less cumbersome, okay? And I'm sure you could find lots of debate on either side of that. One of the perspectives that I've heard, so one of my dear friends in DC is a canon law. He's a military chaplain and a canon lawyer. And he said to me, his perspective was that the couples who had been coming to him for marriage over the years, despite his best efforts, he said, I think somebody made a comment, I don't think it was Pope Francis, but somebody high up in the Vatican, that like 50% of marriages are not really even properly contracted in the Catholic Church, because people are so immature, unprepared, don't know what they're getting into, have ideas about marriage that bear no relationship to Catholic ideas, and so forth. And I have to say, my friend who's been doing this for 40 years now said, he says, I hate to say I agree with that, but he said, I am not seeing a lot of couples who I could honestly say at that time, you know what you're getting into. You are really, and yet there's the other side of that. It's like saying, are you ever really prepared to have a baby? No. You have the baby and you're like, oh my gosh, this is really nothing like what I expect. What did I expect? I don't know, the first time you have one. The same way, can you ever say someone really knows what it's going to be like 3, 4, 5 years down the road in marriage? But I think he's saying something more deeply than that, which is he just really feels that people have an idea of marriage which is popularly, culturally constructed, but is not really constructed around the teaching of the church. My particular pastor, whom I adore, he actually, if couples come and they're cohabiting, he won't marry them if they don't move apart, and if they can't afford it, he says, you can move into the rectory with me, I'm cool. And some of them do. It's a very nice rectory, it's a very nice house, and he's like, listen, you'll have to bunk in with so-and-so, but if you really can't afford it, you stay here, and he says, you're not really going to understand what you're getting into in marriage unless you separate and think about it. Otherwise, you're going to do what Scott Stanley calls sliding, not deciding. You're going to slide into it because you've been together for a while, and her parents and your parents will be ticked, and who's going to take the dog? You can't cut it in half, and and so on and so forth. I mean, he says you're sliding into marriage instead of deciding. So that is the discussion that I hear. I do think that the sort of political annulment for the well-off person is not something you hear about a lot anymore. The church took a lot of criticism for that. But I have seen other annulments that do leave me wondering whether the criteria were properly applied. And the U.S. seems to be the place that comes in for the most, maybe, scandal in that regard. That's really what someone else may know more than me, but that's what I know at the moment. There was a question back here.
I may have simply missed something that you said, but you were talking about at the end, speaking about what we teach in terms of modern values.
Yeah.
And I guess my follow-up question to that is sort of assuming that there isn't the existence of the Christian value of the particular love that exists in a healthy marriage. What sort of is the avenue, if the problem is the pure relationship, as Giddens means it,
Yeah.
Sort of what's the modern value, that I can kind of
Yes.
level at first,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What's being affected, you talked about the people in high school, and they're not seeing the attraction of premarital sex as much, right? And what sort of specifically is happening there?
Yeah.
Values being.
That's a good question. I think part of it is it's the disvalue of meaningless sex, which is, and the heartbreak of no text. Sex, but no follow-up text. That they actually are sort of sensing that this doesn't feel good. And there's been a lot of conversation about it not feeling good in these hookup books. The other thing is that people, it's interesting, you ask younger people, who are the role models, who are the people they turn to in life, and they will tell you it's family. There's the people they can really depend on. And if they see a good marriage, if they see a good relationship, they would like to have someone who would always be there for them. When my kids were in high school, one kid in particular who had some friends who I regarded as somewhat treacherous, friends. And I would say, just stop here for a minute and reflect. Is this how you want to live in friendships? And then while I have you, think about whether you'd ever want a girlfriend like this or whether you'd ever want a wife like this. And I say, how when Dad does something and you absolutely hate it and you turn to me and go, Mom, denounce it. Tell him he's wrong. And I'll say, well, I see we come at this at different perspectives, and you're always making excuses for him. So I will bring him back to that moment and say, I'm always making excuses for Dad. And I say, and he's always making excuses for me, even if we disagree on something. And I say, do you want someone always making excuses for you? Right? And saying, listen, he's a good guy. I don't necessarily agree with that, and this doesn't, but he's a great guy. And pointing out your good qualities. So I think a high school person is 100% capable of understanding what a good friendship is and what a treacherous friendship is. And those values of commitment and being there for the other, et cetera, are something you could certainly communicate to them. The other things, though, the other values that I try and communicate are equality. That the sexual revolution did not leave women, if you really look who suffers the crisis pregnancy, the abortion, the post-abortion distress. If you actually look at cohabitation statistics, they're sensitive to market conditions. So where you have scarcer women, more men, there'll be more marriage and less cohabitation because women set the terms of the market. When it's reversed, when there is a surfeit of women, then if you read Tim Harford's The Logic of Life, in the marriage marketplace, at that point, the women lose out, and they are cohabiting when they would really rather be married. So women are not really, men do the asking. Women enter what we call the marriage marketplace a little earlier than men. They would like to, partly because men don't have women's fertility constraints, partly just because women's, how we're made. And the sexual revolution has not been kind to women's preferences. The other thing about the sexual revolution is it took all the oxygen out of the room about what women really want. Was apparently all we ever want, and we would just go home and shut up and never bother any of you again, is free contraception and all the abortion you could give us, right? So that supposedly took up all the oxygen in the room. What don't we have? If you actually look at what women's preferences are and what actually, what makes women happy and what makes marriage more stable, it's when women are actually realizing, it's not whether a woman is home with kids or out working or working part-time that is correlated to divorce. It's whether she's doing what she thinks is the best thing for the family. And if she's not, if she's out of kilter with that, what she really wants for the family, that's where the strain comes in. So most women, and this is Brad Wilcox's studies have shown this again and again, would actually like to have work that flexes with children. So the vast majority of women say, yeah, I'd like to work part-time for some period of time when I'm raising children, then maybe I want to work full-time before and after. But most women don't have that. The economic conditions are not like that, et cetera. The sexual revolution was very willing to go to the mat to defy constitutional law and make stuff up to give us abortion. And then to fight like the contraception mandate was our life or death. Have they ever done such a thing for women's preferences regarding marriage, work, parenting, nothing. Okay, so the sexual revolution isn't just terrible for what it did, but its opportunity costs are things we're also living with. Over here.
I was wondering if you could explain a little further. You talked about earlier about having a more open conversation. How could we go about having a more open conversation about the damage that divorce and these less stable household functions have for children? Because I know personally, I'm from a divorced family. I have friends that are from a divorced family. And it's like when you both acknowledge that to each other, there's like a sigh of relief where it's like, oh my gosh, you know.
Yeah.
How can we go about opening that conversation, even with, like, especially with people who have had a divorce, and that's an area of sensitivity.
You know, I didn't go into it for purposes of time, but at the end of my book, when I talk about non-marital parenting, I talk about, you know, the question of stigma, right? Just step back for 1 minute. It's always sort of, but you know how we have a dog, and every time the dog comes inside, it shakes. It sort of resets itself, and you take it outside, and it shakes, it resets itself, and then it gets, well. The first thing to do is, our first reaction to that is, oh, people are going to feel stigmatized. We can't talk about these things. But then you shake yourself and you go and you look at the whole context and you go, by God, I cannot turn on the TV or pass a bus or look at a billboard that doesn't say something like, and you go through Baltimore, you know Baltimore's in trouble because half the billboards say 1-800, who's your daddy? Right? And that's it, and it's you send in a swab and they see if they can match it on their database, or you try to get a piece of the hair of the man you think might be your father. And then there is the bus that goes by you, and it's people looking at each other, and it says, he knows, she knows. And it's about AIDS testing. And then you have the new billboards. My son sent me a picture of New York City, and it says, abortion, yeah, we do that. And then it's just come to your local bar, yeah, we do that. Kind of like hardware, like Home Depot, like mulch, yeah, we do that, right? So anyway, and then, you know, the most explicit sex, conversations about people's relations. The idea that the only thing we're not allowed to talk about in this arena is when adults make choices that have repercussions for kids. So we can talk about the most embarrassing details of people's sex lives. They are revealed every day in every kind of news outlet. We can talk about disease. We can talk about abortion. We can talk about, we have crisis pregnancy ads, thank God, all over the place. Why can't we talk about this? And one of the reasons that people will say is, well, because poor people suffer more and you're stigmatizing the poor, which can also mean you're stigmatizing minority groups, right? And I took a stab at this in my book, at the longer, you may or may not have it in your library, but it's in the last chapter, this sort of discussion about how to deal with this question. And I guess I think that, ethically speaking, adults make children, we bring them into this world. We bring them into this family structure. We create the conditions that form them, and we know form them for a very long time. What we do at those times has a disproportionate impact around them. It may be only like 10 or 12 or 15 years, but the impact is 80, you know, et cetera. That I think we have to narrate the statement that we're really going to have to get past the stigma thing here. This isn't about stigmatizing you. It's not about judging. It's about ameliorating. It's about prevention, and it's about, you know, which is the best, a front door solution. And it's about ameliorating things if the front door solution didn't take, and we need a back door solution. And and it's, you know, I have friends who are single parents, friends who are divorced. We've never had the conversation in the context of blame. It's in the context of dealing with things that need to be dealt with the children. And I think you need to narrate that and say, this isn't about blame. It really is God's place to judge people. I cannot put all of that in front of us. That's not what I'm after, and that's not what I'm capable of, and that's not what I want to do. But I would like to help other people in this circumstance. When we were having the marriage debate, the children of same-sex couples who wanted to tell their stories were utterly slammed for saying, my parenting wasn't what I wanted it to be, and were lambasted as ungrateful, terrible. Again, the irony of that, so children's welfare is the only aspect of sex we're forbidden from talking about, and that's just how I would put it. Every other conversation is legit, but not about the welfare of people who are dependent on the adults. I sort of think we have to be past that now. The volume of the difficulty, the fact that the difficulty is suffered more by people who are already vulnerable. I'm sorry, but the adults are just going to have to suck it up. And that's sort of where I am at this point. This is the benefits of being in your 50s, too.
We as good Catholics want to hold marriage to the highest standard possible and never cheapen marriage. So where do we draw the line in our witness when we attend certain marriages, as far as Catholics that are falling away, that are married outside the church, outside in a park somewhere?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I've never had to make that decision. Most of my husband's friends are Jewish. So, I have to say, I think that's a matter of, that's more of a prudential question of scandal. And I'm sure if it's like, if it's what we would consider a bigamous, a second marriage when your first one has not been annulled, and I would think that would be a clear-cut problematic. Another thing, you referred to natural marriage, right? I don't see a problem with attending a real natural marriage. I more and more I see Catholics who say they feel they have to go to a same-sex marriage in the family, and I can't imagine witnessing that to my kids. But other than that, I don't think I think you'd have to consult somebody better than me, a moral theologian, on scandal. I haven't gone to I did have an acquaintance who had didn't annul her first marriage and married again, and that I didn't go on any big detail. I just didn't go. I just was unavailable. But I don't know more of an answer to that. And part of it is, what do you want to teach your kids? And what are they being taught by your attendance at a particular thing?
Do you think there's something the church could do in educating this flock to convince them, and especially the men, that it is possible to live without sex?
You mean before they're married? Anytime.
Yeah. If you think that sex is an essential component of human happiness, and probably sooner rather than later, then all the things we're saying are not going to get very far.
It's true. Now, I haven't thought about framing that. It is true that a large part of the discussion, like for instance, even when this data came out that showed that high schoolers were not having sex, it was utterly ridiculous. The conversation in the newspaper and TV was like, God, they're missing out. These were like mature adults, and I was like, you want the 15-year-old? Are you serious? Like really? That contraception fails like 45% of the time when you're 15. Honestly. So
one of the explanations is they're watching porn instead, so they're still getting sex.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of discussion about that as a substitute. I do think that conversation would be really cool to have, beginning with young guys and women in particular. But imagine how you'd have to structure it so as not to just be, no, Nanette, I remember one time I went on an EWTM program, which I then refused to go on ever after, because I was introduced as, and now let's hear from Professor Alvaré, and why the best sex is no sex. And it's like, you are so done with me, But to explain that the idea that it is instinctual and that it's not subject to reason, that it's not subject to, one of the things I talk about at the beginning with the sexual revolution, it's not related to forming a relationship, it's not related to the good of the community, it's not related to your own relational health with that person, that the idea that all by itself, it's nothing, it's just, as they used to, just another thing to do. I think you could have a good discussion around that. You could have a discussion about how, practically speaking, that's not the impact it has. And what the other person, how that hurts the partner on the other side, and that there really isn't evidence about it. Like, it's not like a health thing where, like, you need to get exercise and eat right and so forth. It is a beautiful building relationship thing, but it's been reduced to something that's almost like an instinct, an indulgence that is good for you when, a need, and a need that's completely individualistic. That has nothing to do with who the other person happens to be on the other side there. Yeah. Oh, that's a tough one. But
And yet it's throughout our culture.
yeah.
Watch movies, TV shows.
Right.
That the assumption is that physical sex is simply a kind of biological need, and there's no use trying to fight it. You might be directed in certain ways.
Right. No, when you actually go back, if you ever, I don't recommend this, but if you ever binge watch either Seinfeld or Frasier, the amount of just sort of like, no, I just had to get that out of my system. Yes. It's sort of like, is really stunning. And they never show anybody being affected by it. It's a blip. It's like, I had a bowl of cereal for breakfast. It meant just about that much. And this is not to say that it's always, that it's going to be epic, right? We don't want to go into the Margaret Sanger routine here. It's just, when it's part of a healthy relationship, yeah. And when it's not, that's the problem. That, I think, would be the message that would be most healthy.
Well, thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.